All right, everybody's here. So good afternoon or good morning, wherever you're joining us from, and a very warm virtual welcome to the official launch of our Transatlantic Task Force report, which is entitled Together or Alone, Choices and Strategies for Transatlantic Relations for 2021 and beyond. My name is Julia Strasheim. I am the Deputy Managing Director of the Bundeskanzler-Helmut-Schmidt-Stiftung in Hamburg that honors the life and work of former German Chancellor and convinced transatlanticist Helmut Schmidt. And on behalf of the Foundation and the German Marshall Fund of the United States, I would like to thank you all for joining us today. What is the Transatlantic Task Force and why do we need such an initiative right now? The task force was created jointly by the German Marshall Fund and the Bundeskanzler-Helmut-Schmidt-Stiftung in order to develop innovative transatlantic policy solutions and chart a new path forward for the transatlantic relationship. And it does so by focusing on what we think are some of the most pressing joint challenges this relationship currently faces. A devastating global pandemic, accelerating climate change, mounting external and internal security threats, a deep economic recession, a rising China, and growing questions regarding technological leadership in the world. We believe that meeting these challenges can only be done by working together. So in order to recommend concrete policy initiatives that the United States and Europe can take together in the coming years, we assembled a distinguished group of 14 American and European experts from different fields. And their virtual discussions throughout 2020, together with what I think was more than 150 interviews that were conducted with leaders from government, from business, from academia, or from nonprofit organizations on both sides of the Atlantic, that's what's really providing the substance for the final report that we are really excited to present to you today. And I am also very excited to have with me today to present these recommendations, both of our co-chairs of the Transatlantic Task Force, Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger, who you know as the chair of the Munich Security Conference, and Dr. Karen Donfried, the president of the German Marshall Fund, as well as, of course, Bruce Stokes, who's the executive director of the task force. But before I hand over to the three of you, allow me a few words on housekeeping issues and the game plan for the next hours. So we'll begin with our panelists' presentations that will highlight a selection of the recommendations from the report. And this will take about 15 minutes. And then we'll open up the floor for questions from all of you. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can use the Q&A function that is on the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can also join the conversation on Twitter by using the hashtag Transatlantic Task Force. And please feel free to already send in your questions while you're watching the presentations. I'm going to collect them and I'm going to direct them and ask them to our panel when it's time for the Q&A. And with that, it's my great pleasure to hand over the floor to our speakers. And Karen, over to you.
Well, hello from Washington. A warm welcome to all of you who have tuned in. And many thanks to you, Julia. It has been such a pleasure to establish this task force with the Bundeskanzler-Helmut-Schmidt-Stiftung. GMF could not have asked for a better partner. And my gratitude also goes to Mike Voyka and Per Steinbrück. This task force reunited me with Wolfgang Ischinger, with whom I've co-chaired a previous task force, and I'm thrilled to be working on this critical issue of transatlantic partnership with someone I so respect and enjoy working with. Wolfgang and I had the good fortune this time, not only of working with the Bundeskanzler-Helmut-Schmidt-Stiftung, but of being blessed with Bruce Stokes as the executive director of the task force, who is the author of the final report. All of us owe a debt of gratitude to the 14 task force members from both sides of the Atlantic, who were generous with their time and their ideas, and made us so much smarter about the issues we focused on. To give you a flavor of those 36 recommendations in our report, Wolfgang, Bruce, and I are each lifting 2 recommendations from the individual chapters of the report to share with you. I'll start and focus on the topics of pandemics and technology. As you can imagine, the the coronavirus pandemic cast a shadow over the task force. We felt that the uncoordinated and at times competitive response across the Atlantic showcased fraying transatlantic ties, but also highlighted another reality, that transatlantic cooperation is essential to finding effective solutions to shared challenges. And that insight was an overarching connection across every issue in this report. We crafted our recommendations in that spirit. So the two examples from the pandemics chapter are as follows. First, we recommended that Americans and Europeans create a transatlantic stockpile of medical equipment and medicines. To better prepare for future pandemics, the US and Europe should regularly report on transatlantic production capacity, output, domestic demand, stockpiles, and exports and imports of critical medical equipment and supplies. We should create a joint stockpile of medical supplies, equipment, and medicines to better respond to inevitable emergencies and to sustain transatlantic supply chains. The second recommendation I wanted to highlight is that we should jointly prepare for the next pandemic by developing a pandemic doctrine and strategy that defines what constitutes a pandemic, explains protocols for early containment and mitigation options, and details how to manage the outbreak collectively if it spreads globally. There are various things that follow from that, including our idea of US and Europe leading an effort for an enhanced global responsibility to report, which would be an early warning commitment, not only for national governments, but for regional health authorities, research labs, and companies to report outbreaks of epidemic diseases. Both of these recommendations are mechanisms to ensure we will not fight future pandemics alone. Transatlantic cooperation can spur global cooperation. On technology, Europe and the United States have long been technological partners, but also technological rivals. But the competitive dynamics are shifting. China has become a major player in the global tech game. Neither Americans nor Europeans have the resources to prevail against such competition on their own. In light of that challenge, our recommendations include, first, that we jointly support emerging technology R&D. The United States and Europe should provide greater financial and regulatory incentives for transatlantic science and tech partnerships, including pre-competitive collaboration on R&D in artificial intelligence, advanced battery storage, advanced semiconductors, autonomous vehicles, 5G and successor generations of telecoms tech, and robotics. Second, we recommend that Europe and the US jointly develop legal and ethical standards on emerging technologies, such as AI, synthetic biology, and other new technologies that promise important advances in health, energy, and food production, but also raise questions about consumer safety, ecological stability, privacy, and weaponization. This cooperation should include a common approach to risk assessment and management. Such standard setting should involve multiple stakeholders, including government regulators, private business, and representatives of environmental, consumer, faith, and civil rights and human rights groups. I wanted to flag these two specific recommendations on tech because the United States is ahead of Europe when it comes to R&D, and Europe is seen as the regulatory superpower. There is opportunity for us to cooperate in both areas. On research, let's put our dollars and euros together to better use them through cooperation. On regulation, while Americans are sensitive about not inhibiting innovation, there is now a broad recognition that greater regulation and more guardrails are needed. To take one example, we saw California pass the Consumer Privacy Act, which so clearly was influenced by the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation. In both areas, research and regulation, there are real opportunities to work together. On that note, I want to pass the baton to Wolfgang. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. I can't tell you how privileged I feel. It's been a wonderful opportunity for me to work again with you. We've participated in such activities before, as you pointed out, and I also want to thank Bruce for an outstanding effort in putting recommendations, ideas that have been voiced by members of this group into a comprehensive format and into writing. So thank you very much. I will try to be as brief as Karen, but let me start by making one fundamental point. The transatlantic relationship has been, and I'm sure no one will dispute that, under considerable strain recently, as the world around us is changing in at such unprecedented speed and with such enormous consequences that for me, from the European point of view, there is really nothing in our foreign policy agenda as important and as urgent as trying to reinvigorate a transatlantic relationship in order to meet the challenges, to be able to meet the challenges together. We are convinced that a transatlantic approach in almost all the areas that we've tried to explore makes a lot more sense than going it alone. So I will now pick out from this agenda two issues, just like Karen did a moment ago. I will pick out China and security. And on China, let me simply say that I cannot think of one single larger future challenge to transatlantic partners than how best to deal with China. And again, if we can deal with the challenge China poses to America and to Europe, to us together, if we can deal with that challenge together, we'll be in better shape. The problem is that our interests do not always align. Europe, in terms of exports, of trade, is significantly more dependent, it seems to me, than the United States. The United States has significantly greater security commitments and responsibilities in the Asia Pacific. So there are obvious differences in priority, in approach. But reconciling these different approaches is what this exercise is all about. So from the number of proposals that we've been able to sketch out, here are two. First, I think we should coordinate better. And our proposal is to establish a high level. We've defined it as a vice presidential level. That's everybody on the American side understands what that means, a vice presidential level transatlantic working group. In other words, run by the vice president on the American side and by the equivalent level, whether it's the president or the vice president of the EU Commission or one of the heads of government in the European Union. That would be our vision of a coordinating body to make sure that we don't go off into different directions. The second part of this Chinese set of proposals is to together, in a transatlantic manner, pursue the very fundamental principle of reciprocity in our relationship with China. Sounds easy, it's much harder to do, speaking from practical diplomatic experience, but it's a very important principle. And we should, thirdly, I just add that as one sentence, we should attempt to cooperate in screening Chinese influence. We in the EU have developed a framework for the screening of foreign direct investments a year ago. That could be one useful model that could be applied on both sides of the Atlantic to make sure we benefit from each other's understanding. And lastly, all of this will not work if we on the European side continue to be unable to define a single European policy strategy on China. So if the EU can't figure out how to speak with one voice on China, it would be much harder to coordinate effectively with Washington, with the United States. So that's our homework, figuring out a credible China strategy. Second, on security, that's for me a much simpler area. Again, I pick out two of our concrete recommendations. I think we've come to the conclusion that the 2% criteria for strengthening our defense effort has not always worked as well as we thought it would. So are there better, is there a better vision to strengthen our collective defense effort? We recommend to defense, we recommend to emphasize not simply the percentage of GDP, but to emphasize capabilities, defense modernization. We need to take our defense effort, we on the European side need to do that more urgently than the United States, to the 21st century. Tanks from the 1960s will no longer be needed. I think we need modern equipment, we need electronics, we need reconnaissance, we need drones, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what we should focus on. Second, one of the classic challenges to the transatlantic community has been, of course, for the last 70 years, how to deal with the former Soviet Union, how to deal with Russia. And I want to highlight this one among the other interesting proposals in our security agenda. We should reaffirm and update our willingness, our interest in developing a joint approach to Russia, whether it's on sanctions issues, whether it's on arms control, whether it's on regional issues like Syria, Ukraine, and many other regional hotspots, more recently on Belarus, on Nagorno-Karabakh. We need to reaffirm our resolve to show up in Moscow with a coordinated transatlantic view. And our concrete proposal is to suggest an annual joint assessment of Russia policy, not only by the NATO Secretary General, but jointly by him and the EU High Representative for Foreign Policy and Security Policy, in order to have a comprehensive approach, not only covering classic security, but the whole spectrum of economic, political, military, and other aspects. So I'll stop here. These are my two segments on China and on security. Thank you very much. And over to Bruce.
Thank you. And I want to echo the thanks to Wolfgang and to Karen, to members of the task force, and those dozens and dozens of people that I had the pleasure of interviewing to develop this report. You all gave very generously of your time, your ideas, your recommendations, and we really appreciate it. I'd also like to extend a special thanks to Julia Strasheim of the Helmut-Schmidt Foundation for her commitment and to this project and her substantive input. She is amazingly good at editing English language text, even though it's not her native language, and especially for her friendship. And I want to echo the thanks to the foundation, the Stiftung, because without their financial support, none of this would have been possible. It's my task to focus on the recommendations in two areas, the economic recovery and climate. The first is an immediate challenge, and the second is an existential one. As the others have done, I'll try to focus on just a few of the recommendations in the interest of time, and we can get into a broader discussion on any of these issues if the audience wants to. We're experiencing the deepest economic downturn since the Great Depression. How we dig ourselves out of this hole will determine the extent of our people's suffering and the nature of transatlantic economic relations for years to come. So we find this to be a very urgent need in Europe and the United States. What we recommend is we need much deeper coordination of current economic recovery efforts. Many of you may know that the Fed chief just the other day strongly encouraged more fiscal stimulus by the United States. I know that the European Union has, for the first time, put together a package of joint fiscal stimulus. My guess is, and I think many economists believe, both of us are going to have to do more. And the US Congress can't even get the stimulus package going that we now possibly need. So I think that there's more to be done on the fiscal side, but what we recommend is that we do this in a joint fashion so that we don't have some kind of asynchronous recovery. We both experienced some of the slowest recoveries in modern history in the wake of the financial crisis. Our people can't afford that slowness. In this recovery, we need to do more, and we need to do it together to avoid being out of sync with each other in terms of our economic recovery. We also recommend that we begin to think now about how we unwind our stimulus of the economy, how we unwind the positions that both of our sets of governments have taken in some companies, because we know that transatlantic economic relations are fraught with fights over subsidies, fights over government ownership. We need to plan to avoid those fights going forward. We need deeper antitrust cooperation across the Atlantic because we know from the experience of the financial crisis that there will be a lot of broken companies littering the business landscape, and they will be snapped up by somebody. And that can create monopolies and duopolies that create antitrust problems. And that can create friction if we don't pursue competition policy in a similar fashion. And we need to coordinate, as Wolfgang suggested, better on foreign investment, not just Chinese investment, which will be one group of investors who may be trying to snap up some of our companies in the wake of the recession. But we should remember that after the Great Recession, after the financial crisis, American companies came into Germany and snapped up a lot of companies and were called locusts as a result. We don't need that kind of friction in the transatlantic relationship. And finally, we recommend a very limited effort to promote more trade that's really tied to environmental issues and medical issues. We suggest a blue-green trade negotiation that focuses on medical supplies and equipment and environmental goods, and do that as a bilateral agreement, open to other countries if they want to join. But we need to start that process to facilitate trade on two of those issues that we think are terribly important. One thing we have to accept is that governments on both sides of the Atlantic are going to need more revenue, and we need to resolve the disputes we have on digital taxation that are now at the OECD and are targeted to be done by the end of December, and the Trump administration has threatened retaliation if European states institute digital taxation without an agreement. We have to accept the fact that all governments are going to need more revenue. We need closer cooperation on levels of taxation, not only in the digital realm, but also general corporate taxation. And finally, we recommend efforts to revive the World Trade Organization, initially to get full complement of judges on the appeal board at the WTO, but more substantively to reform the dispute settlement mechanism through shorter deadlines of rulings and higher standard of review for appeals to get that process working again. we suggest, I think in a very controversial suggestion, that the Director General be given the right of initiative at the WTO. And some other international organizations, the head of it has the right of initiative if the member states aren't doing what he or she thinks is necessary. At the WTO, the Director General does not have that right. We also suggest more plurilateral agreements, recognizing that as a negotiating forum, the WTO is broken, and we need to get that process going through smaller agreements among countries that are willing to take on these commitments. The second issue I'd like to highlight is climate change. The Earth is warming, as you know, at an unprecedented pace, and the human toll of climate change is increasingly apparent. We have little time to put in place the policies and practices necessary to keep the warming below 2 degrees centigrade. And our only chance is if the US and Europe work together and then bring in China, India, and others and their commitments. So we recommend that if the United States leaves the Paris Agreement on November the 4th, as the Trump administration has threatened, that the US rejoin Paris, but more importantly, that we up our commitments and the Europeans up their commitments, because even though Paris was necessary, it is not sufficient to hold down global warming, and that we, in that process, both pledge to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. At the same time, we acknowledge that there has been a substantial amount of sub-federal climate cooperation between cities and states in the United States and their counterparts in Europe. We think that should be improved. We should do more of that, especially if the US does not rejoin the Paris Agreement. But we also recognize that without national commitments, achieving the goal of less than 2 degrees centigrade will probably not be possible, but we think it is a useful complement to whatever's done at the national level. And finally, we recommend focusing much of the economic recovery stimulus on climate resilience. It's my understanding the European Union is planning to spend as much as 20% of their recovery spending on climate resilience. The US currently is committed to spending far less. We recommend a great deal of the focus of recovery funding be focused on climate resilience to build into that recovery effort, an effort to deal with climate. We also recommend eliminating fossil fuel subsidies eventually and developing a common approach to standard setting and taxation of carbon emissions, and a negotiation of a way of resolving disputes over carbon taxation at the border so that we don't, in our efforts to deal with climate change, create new trade wars between Europe and the United States. So that's a brief overview of what we recommend on climate and the environment, on climate and the economy. And now I'll turn this back over to Julia. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you all three of you so much for these insights into the selection of our task force's recommendations. I can see that this has already generated a lot of interest and engagement from our audience. I see the Q&A window popping up constantly, and we have a lot of questions already coming in, so we'll get right to it. But I just wanted to say that if others in the audience would also like to join our conversation, you can, of course, still do so by sending in your questions through the Q&A function or by using the hashtag Transatlantic Task Force on Twitter. We'd really love to hear all of your questions on these issues. So I have a couple of questions coming in that are questions about some very specific policy issues. And then there are some broader ones coming in relating to the overall state of the transatlantic relationship, how the US election will affect this relationship. And I'd like to start with the specifics, also because I know that the report has a lot to offer on this, and then move the conversation to the broader picture and the broader situation. The first question I would like to give to Bruce. A lot of the challenges, but of course, I'd like to give it to Bruce first, but that doesn't mean that Karen and Wolfgang cannot chime in afterwards. A lot of the challenges that we've identified in the report in terms of trade, climate, technology, security, and so on, are not only transatlantic challenges, but they are really global in nature in that they don't have a passport. What could you say, or what does the task force think and recommend about how the transatlantic partners can work with others? I'm thinking, for instance, here of developing nations in addressing these challenges. And I know that there's a lot of it in the report in terms of, for instance, tackling climate change or working with on China.
Great question. And as you say, there are a number of specific recommendations about what Europe and the United States should do together to help developing countries, for example, deal with climate change, for example. We recommend beefed up funding for climate resilience in agriculture, drawing on the experience we had developing miracle rice and miracle wheat back in the 60s and 70s, that we need drought resistant crops. And that's going to require science that is, we have the capability to do that and the money to do that. Developing countries don't, but they need the product of that. We recommend help on digital infrastructure in developing countries. But more broadly to your question, it seems to me that the premise of the task force, and we feel very strongly about this, is that while many of these problems are global and they will ultimately require global solutions, that the United States and Europe together have the capacity to begin to lead the way on these issues, and that we can't wait, that there is no time to build a global consensus on an issue before we move forward. We need to move forward and obviously keep our efforts open to the participation of others if they so choose to.
Thank you. A question maybe even linked to the issue of climate change. We have one participant asking how or observing that discussions about climate change, but also the debate that we're seeing about the global pandemic, are challenging traditional concepts of national security, that they are being questioned. And our participant would like to know how, in the eyes of the task force or in your expert opinion, the United States and Europe should deal with this emerging reality and the implications for defense spending priorities. And if I may add, are the institutions that the transatlantic relationship has, are they equipped to deal with these new security threats and changing concepts of national security? Maybe Wolfgang, since you presented the security section, would you like to go first on this?
All right, thank you. Well, let me offer one simple thought. I think we have tended on both sides of the Atlantic to underestimate the implications of climate change to national security and foreign policy. So I agree with the person who raised the question that there is a need to rethink this relationship. We don't propose this, I think, exactly in our report, but I think the philosophy is that our foreign policy needs to think, of course, of many issues, of military issues, of cultural issues. Our foreign policy needs to include climate. We need a climate international security policy. What does this mean, for example, from a European point of view? It means that we need to consider that if we do not allocate resources to our partners, let's say in Sub-Saharan Africa, we should then not be surprised if before too long additional radicalization phenomena may tend to appear in this part of the world, affecting directly and indirectly European security. Additional migratory movements may turn up at our doors, etc., etc. I think the point is relatively straightforward. So adapting classic foreign policy thinking in terms of classic national security thinking to the appearance of climate as one of the major challenges going forward is, I think, a transatlantic task.
Thank you. We're going to stay with the specific questions on some of the task force's recommendations for a minute. And we have a question on if there are any ideas on transatlantic collaboration or a strategy even to combat the spread of disinformation about the coronavirus pandemic. So in terms of working together, is there also other ideas, or could we imagine a strategy about tackling disinformation with regards to the coronavirus? Karen, would you like to go on first on this?
So I think the issue of disinformation is important across a whole lot of areas. And it's absolutely right that we've seen Russia, China, Iran use the COVID-19 pandemic as a lever to further split citizens in the United States and in European countries. And we do talk a little bit about disinformation in the report, but I would be remiss if I also didn't mention the work of my colleagues here at GMF and the Alliance for Securing Democracy. Their focus is on how do we build resilience in our democracies by efforts of foreign governments trying to undermine those democracies. And they actually have a task force looking at exactly this set of issues. So while we touch on it in a broad sense in the report, I would highlight that work of the Alliance for Securing Democracy if that individual is interested in a deeper dive on that question of disinformation.
Great, thank you. I think one of the, when I see the questions popping up from our audience, one of the issues that has generated the most interest is the topic of China and dealing with China. So a couple of questions relate to this idea that the audience seems to like of the Vice Presidential Working Group on China. One question is if we could have, or if we do have ideas on the mechanics of how this could work on the European side, especially in terms of how this could bring not only European institutions, but also member states, and how and if this should or could bring in the UK. That's the first question on China. A second question of China, let me just add this to it, is what role the task force thinks democratic values and human rights issues should play in the transatlantic relationship in the future, for instance, with regard to how the transatlantic partners deal with China, where we've seen a worsening human rights record in recent years. And I would again give this first to Wolfgang because he presented the China recommendations, but the others should feel free to add their reflections if they would like to.
Yes, thank you very much. What an interesting question. First, just briefly on the human rights related question. One of our concrete proposals with respect to the China challenge, and we have a list of 5 separate categories here, is in fact the human rights issue. So I want to make sure no one believes that we omitted the human rights angle, presenting, as we put it, a united front, a united transatlantic front on human rights is one of our important suggestions. Now, regarding the mechanics, possible mechanics of a transatlantic working group, well, let me just say from my point of view, I think on the American side, it's a little easier. You have one government, you have one president, one vice president, and various government departments. Bringing those together under one roof is probably not so difficult. On the European side, it's slightly more complicated. We have 27 countries, plus maybe the UK. We have the European Commission, we have the European Council. But I think that is actually a very, very interesting exercise. I would think that we would want to mandate the President of the EU Commission or the President of the European Council, if member states wanted this to be a collective activity of member states rather than of the EU Commission, to create a framework where each member state would be represented on various issues, let's say on foreign policy by their foreign ministry, on issues of investment and trade and intellectual property by their economics ministries, or whichever government department is in charge of these activities. I think this could be a very, very promising area of transatlantic cooperation. And Julia, let me just repeat what I tried to say in the beginning. I cannot think of a single upcoming challenge. Well, not only upcoming, it's real, it's there already, that is of a greater dimension than China. China is of huge importance as a security threat, of course, to the superpower United States. China is very, very important, of key importance to Europe in terms of the economic revitalization engine. Europe would be in bad shape at this moment if the Chinese were not already now buying huge numbers of European-made automobiles and other products. So the role of China as an engine of growth, as a partner, but also a rival, a difficult rival, how to deal with that in working together between this one superpower, the United States, and 27 small European countries that could not ever stand up to China on their own. It's really almost a historic opportunity to develop diplomatic skills together.
Thank you. We have about 15 minutes left of our conversation. So, Karen, please.
Yeah, I would just love to jump in on this and build on what Wolfgang said. I'm going to go a little bit deeper on the specific recommendation that he mentioned, just so that the listeners understand some of the level of detail in the report too. This idea of presenting a united front on human rights when it comes to China came out of our belief that the foundation of the transatlantic partnership is a values foundation, and that we have to stand up together for the values we believe in. So we actually say that we feel we need to develop parallel financial regulations that require full transparency about US and European investment in China, that we prohibit the importation of products made with forced labor in Xinjiang and elsewhere, and that we agree in advance what actions we will take if China further erodes rights and freedoms in Hong Kong or threatens the integrity of Taiwan. So we're quite specific in this area. And then secondly, just to build on what Wolfgang said about the idea of this vice presidential level transatlantic working group, we are building here on an existing recommendation. Many of our listeners will recall that the EU suggested such a working group between High Representative Borrell and Secretary of State Pompeo, and the Trump administration embraced that recommendation. So here we're building on an existing idea, and the argument is that because the range of issues we deal with regard to China is so broad, we can't limit it just to the foreign and security policy space. But we need it at that higher level so that issues around economic and commerce and human rights and intelligence become part of that transatlantic conversation. So just wanted to flesh out a little bit what Wolfgang explained. Thanks.
Thank you. I would actually like to come back to one thing that you highlighted just when you started your reply, and you highlighted the issue of values and joint values in the transatlantic community when it comes to dealing with other actors such as China. And some of the values that we highlight in the report on human rights and on democracy. But we also acknowledge in the report that recent polls have been showing that about half of Americans and Europeans say that they're somewhat or very much dissatisfied with the way that democracy is working in their own country. Although we do see a variation between European countries that is quite high. Now, is this something also the US and Europe must deal, or is this something that the US and Europe must deal with by themselves on their own, or is it also a fundamentally joint challenge? And what are the ideas of the task force and how to safeguard democratic institutions, processes and values, or does it come automatically with working together? Bruce, you're nodding on this. Would you like to take this question?
Well, that was one of the central questions we wrestled with in the task force, is that we both Europeans and Americans on the task force were worried about the erosion of democracies in various forms in Europe and the United States, in our democracies. We recognize that each of us are going to have to deal with many of those challenges on our own. In other words, you're not going to get the Americans to fix their democracy because the Germans say you need to fix it, and vice versa. But we did firmly believe that one of the reasons people are beginning to show dissatisfaction with their democracies is they believe that their democratic institutions, their governments, are not solving the problems that people feel they need to have solved. And this leads to the temptation of authoritarianism, where someone comes in and says, "No, don't worry, I can solve this for you. I'm going to be a man on a white horse and I'll deal with this." And I think that, so one of the underlying threads that runs through all of these recommendations is, if we can be more successful at dealing with these existential challenges that we both face, climate, the economy, the challenges of technology in China, things of that nature, the pandemic, and most immediately, we will restore some faith in our publics have in their democracies and the ability of their governments to address the real problems that are facing their people. And that may be something that joint action can help democracies on both sides of the Atlantic.
Thank you. And help maybe not only with trust in democratic institutions and processes, but also trust with each other and in each other. So we have about 10 to 12 minutes left. And I would like to move on to some of the questions that relate to the broader state of the transatlantic relationship and domestic affairs, how domestic affairs affect this relationship. And we have a lot of questions coming in, unsurprisingly, that relate to the issue of feasibility of the recommendations. How feasible, how doable, how realistic we think a lot of the recommendations are, depending on who is gonna be in the White House for the coming years. Karen, would you like to start on this?
I'm happy to start on that. And I'll bring you inside the task force deliberations on this as well, because when we started the task force, we thought, okay, so let's have recommendations for a second Trump administration. Let's have recommendations for a Biden administration. And then we said, well, wait, why should we decide what a particular administration would choose? And we thought, no, we should just lay out what we think are the best ideas and let whomever is in power in 2021 going forward choose from a robust menu of policy recommendations. And we chose these recommendations not because we thought they were easy to implement, but because we really thought they offered some practical solutions to the most vexing and significant challenges that both sides of the Atlantic face. And, you know, to the point Bruce just made, our first order goal with these recommendations is not to improve transatlantic relations. Our first order goal is to try to give both sides of the Atlantic ideas about how they can best meet the challenges facing them in these 6 areas. And we believe that they will be most effective by working together with their allies on the other side of the Atlantic. And so that has then the ancillary benefit of strengthening the transatlantic relationship. So that was how we approached this and how we thought about putting together the recommendations that are in the report.
Thank you. I have maybe a somewhat similar question that is once directed to Wolfgang and once it's a bit broader, and that is how or if we think that transatlantic relations will improve if there is a Biden administration. I mean, there are some that have been musing about whether a Biden administration will want to restore the transatlantic partnership to its shape it was in before Trump, and others have said, well, no, definitely not. He will want to reinvent it. What is your take on this? Will it improve? What will it look like? Will it demand more of Europeans, maybe? what opportunities and challenges, opportunities and challenges do you see in what a Biden administration would bring to the issue areas that are in the task force report?
Well, first of all, when you go through these list of recommendations, which are all based on our assessment that there are problems that need to be addressed, you will find that a significant number of these problems, of these tensions, predate the Trump administration. I think Karen served in a U.S. administration that started to agree with Europeans about this famous 2% goal. That was not invented by Donald Trump. And we've had serious disagreements about how quickly and how credible our efforts can be to reach that goal. Same is true for other issues in tariffs, in how to deal with Russia, with China, and so on and so forth. So my view would be that we would be making a big mistake. We on the European side would be unrealistic. It would be unrealistic to expect that with the election of Joe Biden, some kind of transatlantic paradise would all of a sudden be displayed for us, and all the problems would go away. They will not go away, most of them. But I think there could be one significant difference. I think what has suffered in the course of the last 3.5 years, as we had serious tensions at the personal level between leaders and at the institutional level, I think trust has suffered. Trust is as I've often tried to say, the currency of diplomacy. If there's no trust, it's very hard to buy and sell and agree on anything. So I think that with a different administration, a huge opportunity would arise for reestablishing or rebuilding trust, and that in turn could then offer us opportunities to tackle in a kind of a different, more helpful atmosphere some of these very, very difficult issues that have tended to separate us, Trump or no Trump. And some of these issues go back a decade or more. So we should have no illusions about the severity of some of these issues, but they deserve to be tackled together. That's what the entire report is all about. We think we'll be in better shape if we make a serious attempt of developing a transatlantic approach. That's the idea.
Mm-hmm. So the German perspective is that the transatlantic paradise is unrealistic. Would the Americans like to join in?
I'm happy to jump in. So I think that whatever happens in the US election, there is no return to a status quo ante. So if Joe Biden were to be elected, it doesn't erase what's happened over the past 4 years. But beyond that, as Wolfgang pointed out, the problems that we refer to in this report are longstanding. There are issues that Americans and Europeans have different perspectives on. We've also, however, even through the 4 years of the Trump administration, seen Europeans and Americans come to a more common understanding of some of those challenges. I would argue that if you take the issue of China, there's probably a greater similarity of perspective on both sides of the Atlantic today than there was 4 years ago. So, we're not saying that politics don't matter and who sits in the Oval Office or who sits in the Chancellery or who sits in, pick your European capital, that doesn't matter. But we're making the case that the countries involved in this transatlantic relationship have an overriding interest in dealing with the challenges facing them. That's not a political statement, it's just a factual statement. And we're trying to offer a set of ideas that all of which will not appeal to either administration, but a set of ideas which could be a basis for trying to meet those challenges and putting either the US or Europe in a better place to meet those challenges by working together. So that's the basis that we're coming from. So I don't think it's a transatlantic paradise or a transatlantic hell. I think it's saying that the interests and values that have led to our ability to achieve important things since the end of World War II could allow us to renew that partnership and more effectively meet these 21st century challenges.
Thank you. So we're almost at the end of this launch event, but we have time for one more question. And I would like to pick the one that was actually the first one popping up in the Q&A window, but also I think the hardest one. And I'm going to pose it to all three of you. And you can each one have a pick. So the question is, if there is a new US administration taking office in January 2021, which one is, or the one or two recommendations that the new administration should consider putting forward immediately in your expert opinion? Which one of the recommendations do you think is the most urgent one in the report? Bruce, you unmuted yourself, so would you like to start?
I'll go first. And we did not in the report say, here's a list of what you do on day one or whatever, but we know, and by you using the term new administration, I assume you mean, is there a Biden administration? Biden has already said on day one that he would rejoin the Paris Agreement because, as many of our listeners will know, the Trump administration says they're going to leave the Paris Agreement on November the 4th, the day after the US election. So that, it seems to me, is already baked into a new Biden administration. If the US is withdrawn from the WHO, Biden has said he'll rejoin the WHO. So I do think that there are a number of things that the Biden team has already said they will do on day one. And in doing these interviews, some of which were with Biden advisors, I think there is a belief that Biden will have to make an early trip to Europe to reassure Europeans and to tell them that there's a new team in Washington they can work with. So I think those are some of the things initially we will see. I would say some of the priorities that we highlighted were working more closely together on the pandemic and better coordinating economic recovery efforts.
Can I can I just add a footnote to that? I totally agree with Bruce on the priority of climate. I think if a new administration or a second Trump administration considers the best way to engage with the European public, it's on climate. I think the negative impact of the Trump administration's decision to walk away from the Paris Accord has been really quite devastating for the relationship. So if you're looking for something that could help reestablish trust and a working relationship, here it is. But I would add a second one, a little closer to my own area of competence. If the next president or the next administration could declare its willingness to deal with the climate issues and work closely with Europe on that, it might want to add, and in the same vein, we will recommit ourselves to all the issues surrounding the arms control agenda. I think that is equally something that would quickly resonate in Europe, far beyond the political elites. It would be a most welcome sign of engagement with the world on crucial issues of international and Western security. Thank you.
And I'll just jump in to say that I think you've seen both from Bruce's and Wolfgang's comments that we actually think all 6 of these issues are really important. And we debated in the task force which ones are more important. And there may be an immediacy to the pandemic, but there's an existential nature to the climate issue and others. I would say that whomever is in the White House, whether it's a second Trump administration or a Biden administration, the action of saying, when we look out at the world, we see Europeans as our critical partners, and we want to engage with them on meeting these 3 challenges. And I think, frankly, you could pick any 3 of these recommendations, but the act of saying, we want to work with you to make the world a better place, that's going to be an important note for any administration to work on. And I think there's a lot here for our European partners as well, because regardless of who's in the White House, these issues matter to Europe as well. So there's also an opportunity for our European partners to approach that new administration and say, we'd like to work with you on this, and here's what we as Europe are willing to put on the table and willing to contribute to that effort. So I want to be clear, there is a message here for our European friends as well. Thanks.
Thank you. We said before the webinar that we're actually not going to do closing statements, but I actually think these were 3 perfect closing statements and calls to urgency. So we're out of time. There are so many more questions in the Q&A that we weren't able to answer, but we really appreciate your interest in this topic. So I would like to say thank you to our panelists for their insights. I would like, on behalf of the Bundeskanzler-Helmut-Schmidt-Stiftung and the German Marshall Fund, and of course also on behalf of all the members of our Transatlantic Task Force, thank you all very much for joining us today, for engaging with us, for sending so many interesting questions. We could go on for hours, as it looks like. There are only 2 more things for me to say. First, you can find this webinar, if you want to watch it again, on the GMF's YouTube channel. And second, if you liked what you heard today, or if you didn't like what you heard today, and if you want to read the full report with all the recommendations of the Transatlantic Task Force, the report is now available at the link that you can find in the chat box of the Zoom window. And now I hope you all enjoy the rest of your morning or afternoon. Thank you again for logging in, and goodbye.
Okay. Thank you.